My son called me late one afternoon. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Mom, don't worry. I've already withdrawn money from your account. Some of it is for the wedding, and the rest is related to the house. All the paperwork is done. I'll be busy all day tomorrow. We'll talk later, okay?" I didn't ask him to repeat it. I didn't raise my voice. I sat still in my familiar wooden chair, staring at the wall across from me. The phone was still warm in my hand. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. When the balance appeared on the screen, I had to blink twice. It was almost empty. Tomorrow was his wedding day, and it was also the day everything began to fall apart. But there was one thing. He had absolutely no idea. My name is Helen Moore. I am 63 years old. I live alone in a small house in the suburbs. My husband passed away more than 20 years ago. My life is quiet and straightforward, and perhaps because of that, many people assume I am easy to overlook. I am no longer young, but I have never been weak. If you are listening to this story, you may have stayed silent for the sake of family or overlooked many things because they involved loved ones. Here, we listen to one another, share genuine stories, and remind ourselves that love must always be accompanied by respect. If you see yourself in this story, stay with me. I was never the perfect kind of mother. I never believed I was. I was simply an ordinary woman doing the best I could with what I had. My husband died when my son, Aaron, was only 11. It was a tranquil morning. No warning signs. A heart attack. Quick and final, leaving the two of us alone in a house that suddenly felt far too large. From that day on, I knew I had no choice but to stand on my own. I worked full-time at a small insurance office in town. In the evenings, I took on data entry work from home. There were days I didn't get back until it was utterly dark, cooked a simple dinner, then sat at the kitchen table working late into the night. I can't remember how many appointments I missed, how many gatherings I skipped, how many personal dreams I set aside. I remember only one thing clearly. I never let my child lack the basics. We were never wealthy, not once, but I learned how to save, a little at a time, year after year. No vacations, no expensive purchases, no spending on myself. All I thought about was stability, a roof over our heads, an emergency fund, a future that felt safe enough for my son. Aaron grew up well-behaved, at least on the surface. He did well in school, stayed out of trouble, said thank you, and hugged me before bed. I was proud of him. Perhaps too proud. I became used to giving in, used to giving more, used to believe that if I did enough, everything would turn out fine. I never truly set boundaries with my son. When he needed money, I helped. When he needed advice, I listened. When he failed, I cleaned up the mess. I always told myself that this was what a mother was supposed to do. I didn't want him to feel abandoned the way I had felt when my husband died. But deep down, I knew I was afraid. I was afraid of being alone. As Aaron grew up and built a life of his own, I feared becoming unnecessary. I feared disappointing him. I feared that if I said no too often, he would drift away. So I stayed silent in many situations where I should have spoken up. Looking back, I understand that my love for my son was not wrong, but the way I expressed it was flawed. I loved him through unlimited sacrifice without realizing that, without boundaries, love can easily be mistaken for entitlement. At the time, I trusted my child. I trusted him because I wanted to, and because I never imagined that the boy I had raised for more than 30 years could hurt me in that way. I was wrong. However, I wasn't aware of it at the time. Everything began to change very slowly. If I hadn't paid close attention, I might have missed it entirely. About 3 months before Aaron's wedding, he started calling me more often. The calls were nothing unusual. He asked how I was eating, reminded me to take my medication, asked if I was feeling tired. His voice was gentle and caring, just like the son I had always trusted. Then one evening, while we were chatting about small, everyday things, Aaron suddenly asked about my bank account. "Do you still remember the password? Do you use the app on your phone?" I was a little surprised, but I didn't react strongly. He explained quickly. He said many older people were being scammed these days, that he was worried I might forget bills or miss payments. He only wanted to help organize things better for me. It sounded reasonable. A few days later, he came over, bringing his laptop and some documents. He said he wanted to help me review my records, just in case something unexpected happened. I remember standing in the kitchen, making tea, and listening to him talk about future plans, the wedding, and how he wanted me to worry less going forward. Everything he said sounded sensible, but I hesitated, not because I distrusted my son, but because something felt rushed. I asked why it had to be done right then and there. He smiled and said it was simply convenient while he had time. He told me not to overthink it, that everything was for my own good. I agreed, but only partially. I provided him with the necessary information to check the account. I allowed him to help review some old documents, but I didn't sign anything. At least, I didn't think I did. I kept the most essential papers in a separate drawer. I told myself I was being careful. Yet when Aaron left, I didn't feel the relief I had expected. The house felt quieter than usual. I sat alone in the living room, looking at the neatly organized stack of papers. Everything seemed fine. There were no apparent signs to worry about, and that was what unsettled me. I began to question myself. Was I overthinking? Was I becoming suspicious because of my age? Aaron was my son. I had raised him my entire life. He had never done anything to make me doubt him. I wanted to believe that, because if I didn't, I would have to face a very frightening thought that perhaps, just perhaps, I no longer truly understood the child I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. I met Claire, Aaron's fiancée, several times before the wedding. She was young, energetic, spoke smoothly, and always knew how to make people feel comfortable. The very first time we met, Claire hugged me tightly and cheerfully called me Mom. I thought my son was lucky. Claire often came over with Aaron on weekends. Each time she would walk around the house, not in a nosy way, but more out of curiosity. She asked when the house was built, how long I had owned it, and whether property prices in the area had gone up. The questions were light, paired with a smile, so I didn't think much of them. Once, while I was making coffee in the kitchen, I heard Claire say to Aaron in the living room, "This house is really well kept. If it were sold later on, it would probably go for a good price." She spoke softly, but not softly enough for me not to hear. When I stepped out, Claire smiled and said she was just talking casually. Aaron laughed along, as if I were taking an innocent remark too seriously. I smiled back, but inside I felt uneasy. Claire often asked me about paperwork, whether I kept everything organized, whether someone would help me manage things when I got older. The questions sounded reasonable. They even seemed thoughtful. But every time she asked, I felt as though I was being placed in an unfamiliar position, as if I were no longer fully capable of making my own decisions. I blamed myself for being overly sensitive. I thought perhaps I just wasn't used to my son having his own family. I didn't want to become the kind of difficult mother who constantly mistrusts her daughter-in-law. I was afraid that if I voiced my feelings, Aaron would think I didn't support his happiness. So I chose silence. I told myself that Claire was simply thinking ahead, that she was young and more practical, that I should be happy my son was about to have a stable life. I didn't want to create tension. I didn't want to lose my son over vague feelings that even I wasn't sure were justified. But deep down, a sense of unease had begun to form. Very faint, very subtle. And at the time, I still believed I could ignore it. I discovered everything on a very ordinary morning. The sun was soft that day. I made coffee, opened the window, and went through my usual routine like any other day. I had no bad feelings, no warning signs. I simply intended to check my bank account, as I often did on weekends. The screen took a little longer to load. I thought it was just a slow connection. When the balance appeared, I thought I had misread it. I refreshed the page. Then again. The number didn't change. Nearly all the money I had, saved over the course of more than 30 years, was gone. Only a small amount remained, not enough to manage if anything unexpected happened. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat down and set my coffee cup aside. My hands trembled slightly, but my mind was clear. I called the bank. The representative confirmed that the transactions were valid, having been made from a familiar device using the correct login information. I asked where the money had been transferred. The recipient's name appeared on the screen. Aaron. I hung up and sat still for a long time. Then my phone vibrated. Aaron was calling. His voice sounded calm, even a little rushed. "You saw it already, right? I was going to call you later, but I might as well explain now." I said nothing. "I'll keep it short, Mom. I used the money. Part of it was for deposits, the rest for upcoming plans. Everything is fine." I asked slowly, "How much did you use?" "Almost all of it, but don't worry. I've calculated everything. You still have your pension. It's enough to live on." The way he said it made me feel cold, as if he were talking about his own money. I asked again, "What about the house?" He paused for a second, then said as casually as if commenting on the weather, "Oh, that's taken care of too. The house already has a buyer. They've paid a deposit. The paperwork is being finalized." Something inside my chest collapsed. No pain, no dizziness, just emptiness. "When did you do this?" I asked. "Last week, when you were busy with your medical appointment." His voice remained light. "I just handled it for you. Less for you to worry about." Claire agrees. Claire, "You know, tomorrow's wedding comes with a lot to deal with. I don't want extra stress. Everything is for the future. You'll understand." Tomorrow. Tomorrow was his wedding day, and I had just been informed that my money was gone, that my house was now under someone else's name. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't ask any more questions. I said only one thing. "Are you sure everything is fine?" He laughed. "Absolutely. Just rest, Mom. After the wedding, we'll come by and talk things through properly." Then he hung up. I remained there, sitting on my familiar chair inside my familiar house. Nothing around me had changed, but I knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. I stared into the empty space ahead of me. No thoughts, no clear emotions, only a deep, heavy silence. And that silence was the most frightening thing of all. I sat still for a long time after that call. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply let the silence settle around me, as if my body needed time to absorb what had just happened. Then I stood up. I went into the bedroom and pulled open the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one Aaron had never paid attention to. Inside was a thick folder, neatly tied with an old paper string. I had kept it for many years, moving it with me from one house to another, through every stage of my life. I am not a careless person. After my husband passed away, I learned one thing very quickly. No one protects you better than yourself. Regardless of how busy life became, I made time to learn the basics of finance and law, not to get rich, simply to avoid becoming a burden and to avoid being pushed into a vulnerable position. The house Aaron said had been sold was not everything I owned. On paper, it was true that I was listed as the owner of a house, but that was not the one I was living in. It was a property I had purchased years ago as a rental, with an active lease in place. The house I was sitting in at that very moment was not registered under my personal name. It belonged to a family trust established long ago, even before Aaron became an adult. Aaron didn't know that. I opened the documents one by one and read them slowly again. The lease agreement, the ownership certificates, the protective clauses, everything was still intact, clear, legal. I let out a long breath, not out of relief, but because of a strange feeling, like narrowly escaping danger while realizing that my own son had pushed me to that edge. The money in the bank account was different. That account was in my name. That money had been taken. It was what I had saved for old age, for illness, for the days when I would no longer be strong enough to work. Thinking about that made my chest tighten, not because of the money, but because of the realization that, in my son's mind, my security could be treated so lightly. I sat down at the table and took out a piece of paper and a pen. I began to write down everything I knew, the dates, the amounts, the times Aaron had come over, the documents he had looked through. I wasn't doing this in anger. I worked slowly, calmly, clearly. I was hurt. That was true. I had lost trust. That hurt even more. I realized that the son I had trusted for more than 30 years no longer saw me as someone with the right to make choices. He saw me as part of a plan, a resource, something that could be used first and apologized for later. That evening, I sat alone in the kitchen. Yellow light. A silent room. I didn't think about calling anyone. I didn't think about going to the police yet. I knew only one thing. I was not weak in the way he thought I was. And if I had to face this betrayal, I would face it with clarity, not with tears. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay still in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar ticking of the clock. The house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I had experienced many sleepless nights in my life, but never one that felt this heavy. I thought about Aaron when he was little. A skinny boy, hair always messy, clinging tightly to me whenever he was afraid. I remembered winter mornings when I woke him early, warmed his milk, packed his lunch, then rushed him to school before hurrying off to work. I remembered the times he was sick, running a high fever when I stayed up all night by his bed, afraid that if I looked away for even a moment, something might go wrong. I had once promised myself that no matter what happened, I would protect my child. That promise had never changed. But now I was no longer sure what protection truly meant. If I went to the police, Aaron's life would take a different path. Records, investigations, consequences. I knew that. I wasn't naive about what the law could do. I also knew that a stain like that could follow him for the rest of his life. Did I have it in me to be so cruel, to push my own son down that road? But if I did nothing, what would happen? I would live the rest of my life knowing that my child had taken everything I had and that I had accepted it in silence. Would I still call that maternal love, or would it simply be fear of facing the truth? I turned and looked at the photo frame on my bedside table. In the picture, Aaron was smiling brightly, his arm around my shoulders. It had been taken on his college graduation day. I had cried that day, out of pride. Now, I wondered whether he remembered that feeling at all. I didn't want to punish my son. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to understand. I wanted to know whether he truly realized what he had done, and whether there was still a path for him to make things right without losing everything. Near dawn, I was still awake. I sat up, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. When the first light of morning slipped through the window, I knew I couldn't delay any longer. I would have to choose. And whatever that choice was, it would change the relationship between my son and me forever. Aaron came to see me 2 days after that call. He came alone. No warning. When I opened the door, I saw the familiar expression I had known for years. Remorseful eyes, slightly slumped shoulders, a slow, careful voice. "Mom, I'm sorry." I invited him inside. We sat across from each other in the living room. Neither of us rushed to speak. Eventually, Aaron broke the silence. He said everything had happened too fast, that the pressure of the wedding, money, and work had overwhelmed him, that he had only been thinking about securing the future and hadn't fully considered the consequences. "I never meant to make you worry. I thought I would explain later." I asked him a straightforward question. "Did you ask for my consent?" He lowered his head. "I thought you would agree." I stayed silent. Aaron continued. He reminded me of the years I had sacrificed for him, said he was always grateful, said he just needed more time to straighten everything out. He promised to repay the money, promised to resolve the situation with the house. When Aaron left, I realized something. He had apologized, but not once did he say that what he had done was wrong. Everything was explained by circumstances, pressure, situation, no choice. A mask had fallen. 3 days later, Claire called me. Her voice was gentle, cautious, as if walking on thin ice. She suggested a meeting to clarify things. I agreed. Claire arrived with a small box of pastries, placing it on the table as a gesture of goodwill. She talked a lot, said she understood I was in shock, said she never intended to hurt me. But then, little by little, her words shifted. Honestly, we were thinking about you too, Claire said. You live alone. Leaving money sitting there doesn't really generate much. We're young. We need capital to build our lives. I asked, then who do you think my money is meant for? Claire hesitated slightly, then smiled. Well, in the end, it's for the family, for Aaron. You only have one son. That sentence sent a chill through me. She went on. Many families do the same thing as said. It is said that older people should hand over financial matters to their children. Said it was normal. Said I was just reacting strongly because I wasn't used to it yet. I looked at Claire, this time without trying to be pleasant. In her eyes, I saw an obvious calculation. Not malicious, but not hesitant either. When Claire left, I understood that to her, my assets were not mine. They were part of a plan she believed was reasonable. Another mask fell. The final confrontation happened late one evening. Both Aaron and Claire came together. No pastries, no small talk, no gentle tone. Aaron spoke directly. Mom, you need to call the bank and say, this was just a misunderstanding. I asked why. Because if you don't, things will get very complicated, he replied. I don't want this blown out of proportion. You don't want to be talked about either. Claire added, people on the outside won't understand. They'll think you're confused, old, forgetful, signing papers without remembering. That sentence cut like a cold blade. Aaron stood up and moved closer to me. Mom, I'm your son. If this gets out, what will people say about our family? Honor, family. Familiar words, raised like a shield. I looked at Aaron, trying to find the face of the child I had raised, but what I saw instead was a man trying to push me into a corner using fear. I don't want to make you sad, he said, but don't force me either. That was no longer an apology. It was a warning. I stood up. My voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. You should leave. Aaron froze. Claire frowned. I repeated myself. Get out of my house. No one said anything more. The door closed behind them, leaving the room suffocatingly silent. I stood there for a long time, not shaking, not crying. I only knew one thing. Every mask had fallen, and from that moment on, I had no choice but to face the truth. The decision to act did not come in a burst of emotion. It came very quietly. The morning after that confrontation, I woke up earlier than usual. I made coffee, opened the window, and looked out at the small garden behind the house. Everything was the same. The birds were still singing. The trees were still standing. Only I had changed. I picked up my phone and dialed the bank. When I said I needed to report an unauthorized transaction, my voice was so calm that even I was taken aback. The representative asked me many questions. I answered briefly, clearly, without shaking, without choking up. After that, I went to the local police station. I recall vividly the sensation of holding the pen as I signed the statement. It felt heavier than I expected. My hand paused for a very brief moment before I put the pen down. In that instant, I thought of Aaron. I thought of the child who once held my hand while crossing the street. Then I signed, not out of anger, but because I no longer had another path. The days that followed passed slowly. I followed the instructions, submitted documents, answered questions. Everything was practical, ordinary. There was no drama, only exhaustion and a lingering sense of emptiness. On the day I had to appear in court, I wore a light gray coat. I didn't want to look weak, but I also didn't want to appear hard. I just wanted to be myself. The courtroom was quiet. I sat in the front row. When Aaron entered, I recognized him immediately. He was thinner. His shoulders were stiff. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly. That moment hurt more than I had expected. Not because I wanted him to look at me, but because I realized that even then, he still could not face what he had done. When I was asked to speak, I stood up and answered. I spoke slowly. I didn't add anything. I didn't explain more than necessary. I simply told the truth, that I had not given permission, that I had not known. I discovered everything only after it was already done. I didn't look at Aaron while I spoke. I stared straight ahead. I didn't want my words to be influenced by emotion. At one point, I heard the soft sound of a chair shifting against the floor. I knew Aaron was moving. I didn't turn around. When the session ended, I left the courtroom first. I stepped outside and took a deep breath. There was no sense of victory, no complete relief. Only one thing was clear. I had done what I needed to do, even though it hurt, even though there was a loss, even though none of us walked away from this without wounds. Things did not end immediately after my decision was made. In truth, that was only the beginning of another phase. A quiet phase, but heavy in its own way. Aaron paid the price. Not in the dramatic way people often imagine. There were no handcuffs, no public scenes, just doors slowly closing in front of him. His job was suspended. Calls went unanswered. People who had once been close began to keep their distance. I heard about it through acquaintances, receiving fragments of information, not directly from him. He stopped calling me. Claire disappeared just as quickly. Her phone number was no longer reachable. Her social media went silent. Promises of a shared future were no longer mentioned. I wasn't surprised. She left my life the same way she had entered it, quietly, but leaving behind a chilling aftertaste. I didn't feel happy seeing them like that. I didn't feel any sense of triumph. The dominant feeling was emptiness. On the surface, my life seemed stable. I stayed in the same familiar house. I still had quiet mornings and old routines. I reorganized my finances and became more cautious. I knew I would be fine materially. But there was one thing I could not keep. I lost my son. Not in the sense that he disappeared from the world, but in the sense that the son I once knew no longer existed. I no longer had someone to call and check on every evening. No more small conversations. No more feeling of being someone's mother in the way I once understood it. Some afternoons I stand in the kitchen and instinctively cook an extra portion. Then it hits me that no one will be coming. Those moments hurt quietly, not loudly but deeply real. I ask myself whether I could have done things differently, whether there was a path with less pain. But every time that question arises, I remember Aaron's eyes during the final confrontation, the eyes of someone willing to use my fear to force my silence. I understand that if I had stepped back then, I might have been able to preserve the relationship, but it would have been a relationship built on fear and compromise, and I'm not sure I could have lived the rest of my life that way. None of us won completely. Aaron lost his freedom of choice. Claire lost her plans, and I kept my life, but lost the most precious thing. And perhaps that is the price we all had to pay for our choices. Ultimately, my life slowed down differently. No more days spent waiting for the phone to ring. No more sleepless nights worrying about others. I learned to live more for myself, even if that lesson came late. I still believe family is sacred. I have never thought otherwise. Family is where we first learn how to love, where we return when we are tired. But I have also come to understand something I once avoided. No one has the right to exploit family ties to take away another person's safety and dignity, whether that person is a child, a grandchild, or anyone else. I once thought forgiveness meant silence, endurance, letting things pass because of the word family. Now I know I was wrong. Forgiveness, if it exists at all, only has meaning when the person who did wrong truly understands the consequences of their actions and is willing to take responsibility for them. Otherwise, it is not healing. It is merely the prolonging of harm. I do not hate Aaron. I do not curse Claire. I am simply sad. Sad for the choices they made. Sad that the bond I believed was unbreakable turned out to be so fragile when tested by money and self-interest. I hope that one day Aaron will truly understand what was lost. Not money, not property, but trust. A relationship that should never have been placed on a scale. Older people do not need pity. We need respect. We have memories, experience, and the right to decide our own lives. Love without boundaries will eventually become possession, no matter how beautifully it is disguised at the beginning. If you are listening to this story and see yourself in it, there's only one thing I want to say to you. Protecting yourself is not selfish. Setting boundaries is not abandoning family. Sometimes it is the only way to preserve what little value remains in a relationship. I don't know what the future will bring. I only know that today I live with a calm I never had before. Not perfect, not whole, but enough for me not to lose myself again. And for me, that is enough.